Hi everyone, and welcome to my channel. This video is going to be about the books that I read in the month of October. I read 4 books last month, and so I'm really excited to talk about them with you guys. If you're new to my channel, I make videos about the books that I read. I've been reading 1 book per month about Singapore, which is where I'm based, but I also read a lot of other fiction and nonfiction, so feel free to subscribe if that sounds like something you would be interested in. The first book that I'm going to be talking about is called The First Wave, and this is about JB Jeyaretnam, and Chiam, who were really the first 2 individuals to represent the opposition in Singapore. JB Jeyaretnam, or JBJ, was the first opposition MP to be elected to Parliament in Singapore in 15 years. He won the by-election in Anson SMC in 1981. There are geographical divisions that are laid out throughout Singapore, and each SMC elects the MP that's going to represent them in Parliament. Chiam won his election in Potong Pasir in 1984 and then went on to win 6 terms after that. So he was in that seat until 2011. He is from the Singapore Democratic Party, so the SDP. Later, the book talks a lot about this internal fracture within the SDP between Chiam and Chee Soon-juan, where originally Chiam brings in Chee Soon-juan, who is the first PhD opposition candidate, someone who's really legitimate and has credentials that are seen to be comparable of the PAP candidates. He was kind of this up and rising star, but then in a combination of, in my opinion, Chee Soon-juan actually being shady, and then Chiam being kind of egotistical and possessive of the party that he's founded, they had a big falling out. It's a combination of Chiam paranoia and also Chee Soon-juan, in my opinion, actually just being a little bit suspect that leads to Chiam leaving the SDP. So that's a lot of acronyms, but hopefully that sets out the key parties and the key individuals. JBJ is from the Workers' Party, though at the very end of his life, he decides that the Workers' Party is too committed to working within the current system, and he creates the Reform Party. But they're less of a player in this early analysis of the opposition in Singapore. This book was very exciting for me to read for 2 reasons. The first is, I think there's a common misconception or lack of understanding around the role of the opposition in Singapore. And folks a lot of times just brush this very superficial gloss over Singaporean politics and act like, oh, the opposition is nothing, they haven't really achieved much, and they think of Singapore as a purely one-party state that's quite authoritarian, and I think that really does a disservice to what the opposition has been able to accomplish, and also the vitality of politics within Singapore, especially compared to a place like China where there actually really is no opposition. Secondly, this was an election year, and so we had GE 2020, and it was historic in many regards, but notably, this is the best showing that the opposition has ever had. They won 10 seats in Parliament and also won a GRC. A GRC is a group representative constituency, which I'll talk about later. This book does a great job of not just profiling the key figures in the early opposition days, but also tracing all of the different things that have evolved and changed in elections in Singapore. I will be cheesy, pretty inspiring to follow the stories of the early opposition leaders, because at that time, it just feels like, especially with JBJ, the tenor and the enthusiasm with which these leaders oppose the ruling party is pretty inspirational, because honestly, you had to be kind of crazy and really have a passion for what you want to change about Singapore to brand yourself as an opposition politician. It's really cool to see, from JBJ in 1981 to Chiam in 1984, and then there were 4 opposition MPs in 1991, which was kind of a big blow to the PAP mentality and to their spirits. And then kind of losing seats in parliament in the late 90s, and then kind of jumping forward to today where we have 10 MPs that are affiliated with opposition parties. It's interesting to see these small gains and how really there have been a lot of obstacles and challenges thrown at the opposition. There wasn't really that much about Loke Kyang. I was so bummed that the election this year happened during COVID because there were no rallies, and I've heard that it's really fun. Like sometimes even people who have voted PAP their whole lives still go to the Worker Party rallies because they're so exciting. A lot of JBJ's story is quite sad because he got disqualified from parliament twice. Well, the second time he got disqualified is because he was going bankrupt because he was dealing with all these defamation lawsuits from the PAP. So on the one hand, it's like, why didn't he know how to work within the system and like keep his mouth shut and make sure that he was within the rules so that he could then actually have a voice in parliament? But then the other side of it is you can see all of these annoying little things that the PAP erects as obstacles to trip you up. And the defamation lawsuits for sure is a clear example of the PAP viewing JBJ as a threat and like wanting him out of the equation. So you can kind of think of JBJ as the much more outspoken and principles-based voice of the early opposition. And then you can think of Chiam Si-tong as someone who is able to really build out his following in his SMC, in Potong Pasir. And I'm sure, like, obviously he was also frustrated and faced all of the hurdles and obstacles that any opposition politician would face, but he was just able to trudge on and also at certain points in time even be labeled the responsible opposition, which is a very interesting concept. Definitely there was tension between the PAP and Chiam Si-tong. They would taunt him. Sometimes there would be like these little things that pop up here and there, but there was a period of time where I think the PAP appreciated his presence in parliament because they could say, look, we do have a voice of the opposition, and that was kind of like a blanket defense against any other calls for a more aggressive opposition or for a larger opposition presence. A theme that came up in this year's election as well, during the English debate, Vivian Balakrishnan tells Jamis Lim, I read your Workers' Party manifesto, and the PAP could have written it. And so that was kind of a criticism of you aren't really an opposition party, you're kind of just PAP light. That to me is also super fascinating, just that evolving conception and strategy from the PAP as to how to position and paint the opposition. A lot of times the PAP uses the term a freak election to try and get Singaporeans to vote for PAP because what they mean, so the definition of a freak election is Singaporeans want PAP to form the government. They want a majority PAP parliament, but because they think that that's already going to happen, they'll vote for the opposition candidate in their GRC or their SMC in their constituency, and then by accident, they actually put in enough opposition candidates that the PAP is no longer the majority. Does that make sense? So it's a freak election result because it's not actually what the electorate wants. They actually want PAP to still form government, but because multiple constituencies think, oh, it's fine, PAP is definitely going to win anyway, they then put in a large number of opposition MPs. One interesting thing that Chiam Si-tong kind of leads, it's not his idea, it's some other guy's idea, is something called the by-election strategy. The opposition will only contest the number of constituencies so that PAP, regardless, is going to have the majority in parliament. So they don't even try to contest all of the constituencies. They contest half. That's why it's called the by-election strategy. And they did that a couple times, and it was pretty successful because the average Singaporean, according to how this works, wouldn't be afraid of kicking the PAP out completely. And so they would still feel comfortable voting for the opposition in their local constituency. And then that way the opposition can hopefully make some gains. The evolution of these different tactics and changes to policy and law that the PAP did ostensibly to try and hinder the opposition, I think it's up for debate, and it's not as if this author says categorically these are attempts by the PAP to try and hinder the opposition, but I think it's pretty clear that that was the motivation at some level. The first is the creation of GRCs. There did not used to be group representative constituencies in the past, and when Lee Kuan Yew introduced this idea, the main concern from the opposition is that it would be very difficult for them to field GRC candidates because it was already so hard to find really good, credible opposition candidates given the state of politics in Singapore and the atmosphere. And the GRC essentially made it so that these constituencies didn't just have one MP representing them, they had 5. And there are also racial requirements alongside kind of like the main racial categories in Singapore. There's a whole nother debate about that specifically. And I learned about the Malay majority party called PKMS that also had viewpoints on it. There was a robust discussion in Parliament around tokenization of minorities, although I'm not sure if that's like the term that they used, but how minorities would feel if they were elected into Parliament based on, you know, the strength of the other candidates on that slate, and would it feel, you know, through this affirmative action like they weren't really being chosen based on merit. What's fascinating is that when I first learned about GRCs, I kind of thought it was good. Like, I am pretty supportive of quotas for minorities and women, which is, not everyone agrees with that. I think a lot of people disagree with that, but my initial gut instinct was like, oh, at least then you have some mandated level of minority representation in Parliament. But now reading this book, I realized like the key intent behind introducing GRCs, or one of the key things that it did, was hinder the opposition, because it was very difficult for the opposition to then come up with a slate of 5 people to run, as opposed to previously where they could really just, you know, put forward one extremely strong candidate and have that person win an SMC and then win a seat in Parliament. The other thing was the introduction of the Town Councils Act. And so essentially before, it wasn't as if the MPs for a constituency also were in charge of the town council for that constituency. So to give you an example, I live in Tanjong Pagar GRC, and there's also a town council associated with that. And when my living room was flooded because it was raining every day and the drain out front was clogged, I called up the town council, well, my landlord called up the town council, who employs support staff and maintenance people, and they came from the government to help assess the problem and fix it for me. That isn't how it used to be in the past. And with the passage of the Town Councils Act, these constituency leaders then took over a whole host of municipal issues. And if you think about it, that's going to be in the PAP's wheelhouse. That's like something that they can be successful at. They also have so many more constituencies in the opposition that they basically just outsource these vendor contracts to the different town councils so that they could run everything really well. They had a lot of money that they got through the fees that they charge the residents. And so that's a huge hurdle for, if you imagine just Chiam Si Tong, Chillin, one person in Potong Pasir now has to figure out all of these municipal level issues, figure out a maintenance contract that he's going to do so that, you know, everyone is happy with the upkeep. Something that I didn't really know about. I kind of just thought, wow, the Singapore government's so awesome that they're helping take care of the public estates so well. But I think when the Town Councils Act was first introduced, part of the intent, maybe not all of it, but part of the intent was to demonstrate how much better a really strong and well-resourced PAP could deliver on these municipal issues in comparison to the opposition. Last thing I'll talk about is the introduction of nominated members of parliament and also something called non-constituency members of parliament. So NMPs and CMPs. And that's another thing where when you first hear about it, you think, okay, that makes sense. But then when you actually get the history and you learn the origins of where that came from, you realize, okay, this was just like another hurdle to try and tamp down the potential growth of the opposition in Singapore. So the nominated members of parliament were supposed to be well-established thought leaders or key opinion leaders in Singapore that could give support, research, their opinions to the MPs, and that was seen as a way to have more opposition viewpoints or more consultative processes without actually having opposition MPs in Parliament. And then the idea of NC MPs is something that JBJ was really against from the get-go, because it's given to the opposition party that wins the most amount of votes in the election, but there are certain restrictions on what the NCMP can do. Like, they can't vote on certain legislation. Like, they don't have the full powers of a member of parliament. And so it's another kind of halfway pseudo role that the PAP has created, because they think this will kind of stem the desire or any calls for a diversity of opinion without actually fully empowering an opposition MP. I think this book is good for students of Singaporean politics. I think if you're living here and you're interested in politics or you followed the election, you should read this, because I think it's an important piece of education. And I think, as I described in a couple different examples, you can hear about something and think one thing, but then when you learn about where it came from, it really gives you a lot of context for what the impact of something is. But I would just warn you that this is a very long book, and it took me 2 months to finish. And especially the parts around Chiam Si-tong and Chi Son-juan's like big falling out, it got kind of tedious. I was kind of like, how depressing is it that like this phase of politics is just revolving around two men's egos, which I guess is a lot of history. I would give this a 4 out of 5. If you got really revved up by the election this year, I really think you should read this. If you're going to have any opinions at all around the opposition or like the role of the PAP and what the PAP has done and can do, you should really like read this first so that you can speak with a bit more authority and not just hold like the very superficial top line opinions about it. But other than that, it might be a bit too detailed and focused on a particular period of history for your average reader. The next 3 books I'm going to talk about are all fiction books. So the first is Normal People by Sally Rooney. This is another book that I picked up because I wanted to read the book before I considered watching the television series, which I've heard is really good. Sally Rooney is a pretty well-known Irish author. She has only written 2 books. This is her second book. It came out in 2018. I've also read her other book, which is called Conversations with Friends. The general premise of this is it follows the relationship between a boy named Connell and a girl named Marianne, and they're from the same hometown in a small city in Ireland, and their relationship, how it grows and evolves from their childhood period to them being college students at Trinity College in Dublin. The way that the book is structured is you can get the thoughts and feelings of both of the characters, which is done in a good way. I think the character development, like Sally Rooney's characters are always really compelling. You can definitely see part of what I assume is her own personality in the characters that she writes. Both of the main characters in her first novel and this one are a little bit messed up, super well read, kind of Marxist, very intelligent, anti-capitalist, and so you get some hints of that as well in the kind of the social milieu and the mindset of this pair of characters. The book goes back and forth between each of them, but also across time. And so we get kind of these jumps across the timeline as we move through their lives. Nothing particularly mind-blowing, but I do really like Sally Rooney's style. I think she does a very good job of describing somewhat mundane things or character traits or even events, but then lending it really good authenticity and also kind of hinting at the deeper meaning. And I feel like it resonates well with me, and she's able to capture kind of the voice but also the feelings of someone who's misunderstood or lonely. She definitely has like deeper texture to her characters. They're not one-dimensional. I did like this one better than Conversations with Friends. I think it's just a bit more digestible and a bit shorter as well. This was definitely a book where I got hooked from the beginning and then was just really invested in the love story between these two characters and wanted to see how it panned out. And it wasn't a trite or overdone story. And so in the end, I was pretty pleased with kind of the plot and the development of their relationship. I will give this a 4 out of 5. I read it so fast, honestly, that I think I would have to revisit it to really remember some of the parts that spoke to me. I think sometimes Rooney can be a little bit forced in her writing, but I was just so captivated by the characters and, their friendships and their relationship that it didn't bother me too much. So I would definitely recommend it if you're looking for kind of a modern novel that looks at kind of the millennial generation and how love and relationships plays out. And I suppose if you're from Ireland, you may enjoy it even more, but even as like an American, it was a lovely story. This book was given to me by my friend Yeong, so shout out to Yeong. She gave this to me a long time ago, I can't even remember when, and I just got around to reading it. It's called The Hate You Give, and it's by Angie Thomas. It was written in 2017, and the title actually comes from a Tupac lyric, and I guess this was like very obvious to everyone, but I had this book for so long and didn't realize that this spells out thug. Tupac gave meaning to the phrase thug life and said that it stands for the hate you give little infants fucks everybody. I think it's a good tagline for one of the key themes in this book. Just really speaks to that kind of tension and also project of coming from two worlds and trying to give back to your community and all of the obstacles and hurdles that Black Americans have faced in the US. So the main character, her name is Star, and she's from a poor neighborhood with a lot of drugs and gangs, and her father was in prison when she was young and also was a gang member, but her parents really want her to have a different future, and so they send her to this prep school where she's only one of 2 Black students, and so she's constantly straddling the line between her origins and her upbringing and her culture, and then also like the voice and the identity that she has to put on to move through this world that's completely different. This is definitely in the young adult genre, so I think the target audience of this book might be high schoolers or middle schoolers, but I love some good YA, and I was really pleasantly surprised. I thought this book was great. I really enjoyed it, and I was very hooked. I thought that Angie Thomas did a phenomenal job of capturing the voice of a young woman and a high schooler who is both coming of age but also navigating extremely traumatic events. I won't spoil the plot, but you can tell from reading the book flap that it's about a young unarmed Black man who's shot by a white police officer in her community and everything that unfolds after that. Definitely the standout of this book was the way Angie was able to capture Star's voice, and she was just such a developed character. It's told from first person point of view, and that just really reminded me why I love young adult fiction so much sometimes. She really captured that youthfulness and that honesty and that raw emotion and a lot of confusion that you feel when you're growing up. Like, it felt very fresh and original. The dialogue is great. It's kind of funny in some parts, but also heartbreaking in other parts. So I really enjoyed this a lot, and I wasn't expecting to fully. I think maybe that's part of why I hadn't read it, even though my friend gave it to me a long time ago. It also touches briefly on some of the things that her other friend who's Asian faces, like very briefly, but of course I picked up on that. And it's so cute because they both have this annoying white chick friend who has done like really minor microaggressions towards them, and so then Star and the other girl decide to create like a minority alliance where they're gonna like have each other's backs in case this annoying chick says anything else. And I just think that Angie Thomas was able to capture a lot of the details, like, you know, the clothes that they wear or the things that they think are cool, or their vernacular, that just made it feel really honest. I will give this a 4.3 out of 5. I really enjoyed it, but just know going into it that it's more of like a young adult fiction story. The last book was my book club book. We read Flight Behavior by Barbara Kingsolver. This is the second book I read of hers. I think she's most well known for the Poisonwood Bible, which I haven't read, but I read the Lacuna, which is about Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. But anyway, this book is about a young woman named Della Robbia, who is 28 years old, and she lives in a very rural part of Tennessee. She's already married, she has 2 kids, and she feels very stuck in her life. One of the key plot events, without giving too much away, that happens is monarch butterflies start settling in rural Tennessee instead of doing their normal migration pattern in Mexico. And so one of the main themes of this book is really climate change, and also how Americans who are in rural areas and who have typically been cast as people who don't really understand or don't believe in climate change, how they interact with that, and their relationship with the earth, usually being, in this case at least, they are farmers, they raise sheep, they also have orchards. The fact that they're close to nature, but in many ways are painted as having a much more distant relationship with global warming and accepting that. It really reminded me of a lot of the discussion that happened when Hillbilly Elegy came out by J.D. Vance. And there was just so much commentary saying this book explains why Trump won the 2016 election. It depicts middle America. It's the memoir of J.D. Vance, who is from Kentucky. There was all of this punditry about how, you know, by reading Hillbilly Elegy, you can really understand where these people come from, and you shouldn't just malign them in a certain light, and that's to the detriment of these coastal elites who talked down to and condescended to these people, who then in turn went and voted for Trump in droves. I disagree with that characterization. All of that is building up to the point I want to make, which is I feel like this book actually did succeed in doing that. I think Kingsolver did a wonderful job of depicting a lower income, rural America family, the traditions that they hold on to, the values that they care about, and the struggles that they go through. And it really lent to this sense of empathy with them, so much so that it took me several chapters in before I picked up on certain socioeconomic indicators or flags that made me realize that actually in my day-to-day life in the US, I would probably never run into something like that. Even as a Kentuckian, because I live in the city and I have a very privileged background, it's not likely I would run into a family like this. Only later on, you kind of pick up more and more information that made me realize, wow, like her level of education and her socioeconomic status is like so different from me. And I think that just goes to show how Kingsolver was able to have a really sympathetic, I guess, depiction of this community. But that might be the wrong word. It's more just like an honest one, a correct one. And I think it's because she's from Kentucky, and I think she's had a lot of experience and touch points with these families and these types of people. But I definitely think that's the strong suit of this book, is her ability to portray working class rural families who have had everything they know and have trusted just ripped out from under them in this new age. You definitely know that Barbara Kingsolver believes in climate change, thinks it's a huge threat to our society, but also just is describing the plot and these characters with such empathy and honesty that it's not as if there's any judgment occurring. Instead, she's kind of like making the bridge or connecting the dots as to how both can exist, and finding that middle ground, I guess. The weaker aspects of this book, there are some characters that are a bit hastily drawn. They kind of just fit an archetype, or they fit in as a plot device. It was also really long. Barbara Kingsolver does like these really, really descriptive sections. For example, one that really sticks out to me is when Della Robbia goes thrift shopping, and Kingsolver literally describes like everything in every aisle of the thrift store, or at least that's what it felt like. And I think sometimes it's very effective and successful because it really builds a sense of atmosphere. It really allows you to feel like you're there, and it's not usually for naught. Like usually it's building up to some type of insight, or it's allowing her to add an extra layer onto the world building. But I just had to start skimming at some point because I just don't find that detailed of descriptions interesting to read. So it was a long book. It was much longer than I expected it to be. And maybe the last thing I'll say is there's also an entire interior story that's happening because Della Robbia is very unhappy in her marriage. And so a lot of the novel that's about her struggle with her marriage and her family and her circumstances, I thought was really well done. And also the fact that she's really smart and industrious and hardworking, but just not given any of the opportunities or the ability to capitalize on that. And there's definitely a strong point Kingsolver is making in terms of access to education and access to quality infrastructure for these rural communities. And Della Robbia is an example of someone who could have had a world of opportunity if she had just been born into different circumstances. So I thought that was another strong suit of this novel. There's really strong imagery related to turmoil in the land and flooding and things rotting and things being uprooted, and that kind of ecological destruction I think she did describe really well. And for this month's book club, we actually did book plus film pairing. So the movie that my friend picked to accompany this novel is Beast of the Southern Wild, which I had seen before when it first came out, but it was a really good match because that movie is also all about the effects of ecological destruction on lower income communities. So I thought that was like such a good pairing. I'm going to give this a 3.8 out of 5. I'm glad I read it. I'm not sure I would really recommend it to my friends unless this was something that unless they were already interested in kind of the depiction of rural communities in the US or novels that depict the effects of climate change. So those are all the books that I read in the month of October. I will hit you with another video for the month of November very soon. In the meantime, thank you for watching. I appreciate all of the support, and I'll see you in the next one.